Good now? Yeah.
Not yet.
Not yet. See. Is that better? I'm being able to see the slides and stuff. Well,
So
we're gonna do.
I'm so sorry. I don't think it's before. I don't know. I don't have this computer doesn't have the.
One second.
Okay. Okay. I was gonna go to school, but it was like.
Now should be good. Okay. All right. Okay. Now we're gonna get started. So we're gonna start with some more sort of cognitive psychology things, and then we'll go into the kind of practical implication of that for pedagogy. Before we do that, we're going to talk a little bit about the nature of knowledge. So we sort of touched on this in the first lecture and the discussion we had, but I'll sort of present what I think is kind of an interesting philosophical problem that leads into some more modern approaches to the study of knowledge and how that feeds into learning and feeds into cognitive science and all these other things. So, but yeah, let's get started. So something to understand about educational psychology is that it's actually a very sophisticated science, and it currently studies brains as they're actually learning. So it's not something where you're just studying like phenomenologically or like after the fact or abstract theorizing. Educational psychologists actually study brains at work in the MRI machines, actually seeing the biological processes, as well as empirically in classrooms and other settings. And so what they're really studying are these complex and overlapping and regulatory pathways in the brain that are being triggered by experiences as people learn. So there's an interesting thing here, which maybe makes sense given that presumably cognition originates in the brain, is that how your brain learns. There are changes you see in the structure of the brain before people become consciously aware that their behaviors or learning has taken place. That does not necessarily mean, however, that the same behaviors that you see people engage in are corresponding to the same underlying neural states. So we have this kind of broader question of what does it even mean for the brain to know? And any sort of account that we might give might be too limited. There might be other ways for brains to behave or behaviors to be generated and learned in the brain. So this is just one perspective. So I asked this question the other day, what is knowledge? I think there were some good, lots of good discussion in the room. There's also some good discussion for people on Zoom. And I like this answer that had to do with knowledge is how people acquire behaviors or change their behaviors in relation to things that they're experiencing. And that's kind of the answer that I'll end up giving. But there's this very old answer of what is knowledge? Knowledge is justified true belief. It's kind of the like answer that most people will give if you ask them. But there's some problems with this idea, and I actually think the problems with this idea have implications for understanding how people learn. So the counter argument, there's this fun comic about this, it's called the Gettier problem. And so Socrates goes to the oracle at Delphi, and Socrates is told that he's the wisest man. And he says, this is good, I am the wisest man, I like hearing this. But he's not quite sure. So he goes to all the people in Athens, and he asks all the people in Athens questions, and he discovers that he is in fact wiser than they are, because he knows that he knows nothing. So so Gettier comes along, and Gettier's critical of Socrates about this conclusion. So he says, what if knowledge is justified true belief? Imagine that the oracle has told you that you are the wisest man, and you go around to Athens, you find everybody else lacking, and you conclude that you're the wisest man. But what if there's actually somebody else named Socrates that lives in Athens who is wiser than the Socrates that Gettier is talking to? Then Socrates would have been justified in believing that Socrates is the wisest man, and it would be a true belief because there is a man named Socrates in Athens who is the wisest man. But the Socrates that is believing that Socrates is the wisest man is not the Socrates who is the wisest man. So that's confusing. The problem here is that you can believe something, you can have a justification and a belief that something is true, and that thing can be true only by coincidence. And in that situation, would your belief in this justified true belief, would that be knowledge? So it's called the Gettier problem. There's all sorts of fun examples in the philosophical literature, but it points out that this, at the very least, that this definition of knowledge is not sufficient. So we'll leave for a second. I'll come back to what knowledge is from a different account. But when we do educational theory, we're going to make an assumption that knowledge is not entirely subjective, that there is some kind of true correspondence with the world when we talk about knowledge or belief. But really, we're not going to worry too much about that. We're going to really think about what the overarching pattern, how knowledge is stored and represented in the brain. And I think this is also a better way to think about knowledge in general. And then when we talk about knowledge, we're talking about coherent sets of belief that have relationships with other things we might believe. And then hopefully there's some correspondence that we would work out between those beliefs and reality. And so what we're going to study when we're talking about teaching and learning is we're talking about these patterns of how knowledge is encoded in the brain. So again, sort of maybe the main takeaway from this kind of part of the morning is going to be that knowledge is many different things. So it's not a single category. So there are different types of knowledge, and different types of knowledge are represented differently in the brain and by the brain's regulatory processing systems. And there might be different representation schemes in the brain for, so not only is knowledge represented differently, but there might be different kind of representation or storage schemes in the brain for different kinds of knowledge. So some categories of knowledge we'll talk about. So declarative knowledge is probably what we think the most of as being knowledge. So these are facts and concepts, integrated understandings of the world, and mental models of the world. So F equals MA is a bit of declarative knowledge. Procedural knowledge is how to carry out tasks, how to stand up in the front of the room and give a lecture. It's a procedure. It's something that people do and learn how to do, and they repeat doing it the way they've done it before. So it's a procedure that the brain has learned how to do, repetitive tasks that the brain does many times. And then I think the really important one, especially when we talk about these kinds of, again, to lean on the hierarchical taxonomies of learning, is self-regulatory or metacognitive knowledge, which is knowledge of the learning process itself, or regulatory learning, where you're monitoring how your brain is learning how to do something and testing whether you're learning, if you need to make adjustments, this sort of thing. So anything, when we're teaching, we want to be getting at all three of these things. We want to be teaching people some facts, some procedures to do with those facts, and also some understanding of how they can monitor their own learning to adjust when you're not around as the teacher so that they can learn other things. I gave this definition before, and I think this is important. Learning is adaptive reorganization in a complex system. So when we're teaching people things or when we're learning something, you're reorganizing these schemes that are in your brain that consist of all of these individual kinds of knowledge. There are different contexts in which you can learn. So we're not going to talk too much, I think, about informal learning contexts, at least for today. But this would be not classroom settings. So you learn cultural knowledge, identity, professional skills, these sorts of things. You tend to learn them in informal settings, not in classrooms with somebody standing up in the front and lecturing or giving you problem sets. So these are some quotes that I think are, so these are all from Carl Rogers. And these are, I think, the really core things about how to reduce barriers to learning. So I mentioned this earlier, but the best kind of learning, significant learning, is can be really threatening because what you're doing is you're changing the perception of yourself. If you think about your identity is a collection of beliefs that you may hold about the context you live in, about your history, about where you're going to go in the future, your dreams, these sorts of things. And when you're learning, you're modifying these beliefs. So your identity is under threat intrinsically. So if you want to affect this kind of change in yourself or in others, you really have to reduce the kind of external threats. So again, safety and vulnerability in classrooms is really important. And it's fundamental to it's a fundamental prerequisite for learning to take place. Another thing that's sort of important, again, is the sort of motivational piece, is that learning is a fundamental human need. We all want to engage in it, but we're often prevented by things external to us from engaging in this process. And so the best kind of learning is when you can get somebody to be motivated and engaged on their own in this process by which they're reshaping their own identity, to take ownership over their learning. So what we're going to focus on, so I hope we've kind of touched upon these first two questions in the first lecture, but now we're going to focus on this process of learning. And the technique that I'm going to introduce is this technique called scaffold building. So we're going to go through a lot more cognitive psychology, and then I'll sort of introduce this in practice. One thing I want you to sort of get away from is in your teaching practice is exactly what I'm doing right now. So there's the sage on a stage model where somebody stands at the front of the room and imparts wisdom. And really what you want to do is you want to move your teaching into this guide on the side model. So you are standing to the side of somebody who is engaged in the learning task. In the DSFP, this looks like problem sets with instructors walking around or worksheets, this sort of thing. It can also look like you standing at the front of the room, but engaging in share back activities with the room as a whole. So less of this lecturing, imparting wisdom that is received, and then imparting it on people, more of you standing to the side and letting the learners take the active role. As I've sort of alluded to, the kind of, yes.
When you say a share back activity,
yeah,
could you find what that is?
Yeah, so I mean that's what we have done, or that's what we did in the first lecture. So that's where I say to everybody in the room, we do it like a quick pair share. So say everybody pair up with the person next to you, answer this question, think about it, and then we're going to all come back together and we're going to have a discussion as a room, where the person at the front is just facilitating that discussion, moving it from idea to idea, providing clarity, context, links, that sort of thing. That's what I call a share back. So as I mentioned, we're going to go with this kind of model of knowledge, is that it's socially situated, that it has to do with identity, beliefs about yourself, and that knowledge is constructed through these kinds of interactions between people, right? So we engage in this collective, maybe we're given a technical problem, we each get a perspective on it, we talk with each other, and we socially construct the kind of takeaway messages that are going to get encoded in our declarative or procedural knowledge. And that process by which we interact with one another is that self-regulatory metacognitive knowledge where we are checking each other's beliefs and modeling how to check ourselves and improve our own. So I think there's a nice little video that kind of illustrates this. So I think I have to this, so hopefully this works. But I like this clip from Star Trek. And I'm never going to miss an opportunity to share Star Trek things. The audio is not working. Sure. Oh, that. Oops. This worked when I tested it, so I'm not sure. Oh, I know why. That's fine. Go. Okay. This should work. Now it's not going to work at all. Okay, I'll have to. Okay. I'll have to share the video later. I did test it. It did work like a couple days ago. So I don't know. But this is a nice, I'll just go ahead and, this is a nice clip. It has to do with language learning, which is where this, especially social constructivist theories were really based in. And it's basically one of the characters has a glass that is filled with a liquid and asks the other character, says a word in an alien language and says, what about this glass am I referring to? And one of the characters, character being asked says, you know, oh, that word means glass, hot, liquid, brown, so on, right? And the question, the assumption here is that both people think about the world in fundamentally the same way. And so when you point at something and say a word, that it refers to one of a small number of categories that you would guess immediately. But maybe it means something completely different. Maybe it means sustenance or life or something, right? So if you're talking to somebody from a really fundamentally different culture, even kind of our shared assumptions about what knowledge looks like and what those links are might not be the same. So it's a really nice clip though. Sure. Yeah.
Maybe if you're sharing that clip separately, you could contrast it with the Dharma clip. I think
Yeah.
That's purely socially constructed with zero context of like that one.
And I had forgotten this clip is not from the Dharma in July episode, from a different episode where they make this point, but I assumed this clip was from the Dharma episode. So I'll share both of those. Okay. So yeah, so I just sort of went through this a few minutes ago, so I don't think we'll need so much of a reminder, but again, there's kind of declarative, procedural, and self-regulatory or metacognitive knowledge. So so declarative knowledge is semantic knowledge. So this is understanding that is disconnected from a specific experience. So we all know that F equals MA, but I mean, I'm actually curious, how many of you can remember the first time that somebody wrote down in second law? Did anybody raise your hand? A handful of people, but it's definitely not everybody in the room, right? And there's going to be other physics knowledge, even if you remember that moment, there's going to be other physics knowledge that you hold that you do not have any recollection of who taught it to you, when, or how, right? Episodic knowledge is events that are remembered as distinct entities. So when we think about memory, we think that we have this really great episodic knowledge. I guess I don't have the caveat here, but it will come up in a later slide. This kind of episodic knowledge is actually very insecure. So there's a lot of studies that show that our memories of distinct events are not very reliable. And one of the hypotheses about why this is that episodic knowledge is not actually a kind of knowledge, and our memory is not actually storing snapshots of events. Episodic knowledge is a way for the brain to model events based on previous events. What we store is not actually a memory of an event, it's a model of how we would react if we encountered a similar event in the future. And that's why episodic knowledge is not very secure and it's not very reliable. It's a kind of regulatory knowledge, not a kind of snapshot. Okay, so how do we learn? How does the brain work? This is a very simplified scheme, but we have sensory memory, which is literally I'm standing up in front of the room and I'm seeing all of your faces. Sensory memory. Short-term memory is I look at one person in the room and I think, oh, that is Tanner, right? I have short-term memory, that face is stored in my brain, and I connect it to something that I pulled out of my long-term memory, right? Long-term memory is the stuff that makes it into the brain's kind of neural structure of neurons. And we have this sort of bottleneck that goes between our sensory memory, which has this huge bandwidth. There's all of this information that is always hitting you every moment, and your brain is filtering and processing it. And the thing that is doing that filtering and processing is this kind of short-term memory, which has a very small amount of bandwidth to go between long-term memory and sensory memory. So there's this implication that there's a severe bottleneck between sensory memory and long-term memory. So we can only hold a limited amount of information in our conscious awareness. So if you're trying to teach somebody something, the reason you can't just put information in their head is all the information that is hitting you in any given moment, only a very small amount is going to make it into your long-term memory. So as I sort of have mentioned, this kind of long-term memory and our episodic memory, these sorts of things are regulatory systems that are helping us to regulate our sensory memory that is having to process all of this information. So that's why there's this bottleneck, is these are not systems that are actually storing information, these are systems that are regulating the kind of fundamental biological process of experiencing the world. But we're going to go ahead and treat long-term memory as if it's this organized, independent, coherent system where we put knowledge and store it for the future. Yeah, so I sort of said this already. Episodic knowledge, context experience, flashbulb memories, stories about ourselves, not accurate. It's really just a way for the brain to model situations that we might encounter in the future. This kind of semantic knowledge, and this is really kind of the deep takeaway point for a lot of what we're talking about this week, is semantic knowledge is cross-listed and it's highly networked. So when we're learning something, we're developing this hierarchical organization scheme where we take our semantic knowledge, we build these cross lists, and then we try and retrieve by having entry points, having multiple entry points where we can go and pull information based on multiple linkages that that information has. Yeah.
I was about to ask.
Yeah.
So if you are multilingual, for example, and not necessarily just spoken languages, even coding languages. So do you build multiple of these cross lists then?
Yeah. So the question is, what if you're multilingual, right? And I think there's this deep question, and I think it's an especially deep question right now, is language the same as, like, is it somehow the same as knowledge? If you know how to speak a language, do you know how to like construct meaning? Or is meaning and knowledge and understanding separate from language? But the question is, how cross-listed it is if you're multilingual. And I don't know enough about how the brain learns and stores language, because my understanding is that there's separate parts of the brain that are responsible for language from parts that are responsible for more abstract thought. But all of these things, including in the kind of wiring of the brain, all of these things are highly networked together. So the answer is that your brain is building all of these connections, and there are many. It's not like a simple directed acyclic graph like we've seen before. There are cycles. It's not necessarily directed in linear ways. Things are highly cross-listed, and I'll show an example of. I'll show a very simple example of that in a few minutes. So why do we all only study one field? Right? Why is higher education structured in that you study one thing or maybe two things that are related? And the reason is that these cross-listed schema of hierarchical kind of networked information, these are always defined over a domain, and having some domain background means there's sort of pre-existing slots in the brain where new information can fit in, right? So as physicists, we have existing slots where somebody can propose a new law of gravity, and I can put that next to my old law of gravity, and I can build connections, and I can make critical statements because I already have a structure for that. Whereas somebody who's never studied physics before is going to be amazed that you can write down Newton's laws, let alone Einstein's equation. I mentioned this already a little bit, but procedural knowledge is knowledge that consists of scripts or extended action sequence. So these are often kind of deterministic algorithms for completing a task. So this might be, I'm going to get in my car and I'm going to drive somewhere. And there's a script that says I turn on the car and I put my seatbelt on, and then I can drive, right? And driving a car is kind of or riding a bike, lots of these things are kind of the classic example of this kind of procedural knowledge, because especially when you're driving a car, you're engaged in a very complicated task of trying to avoid hitting other cars, hitting pedestrians, things like that. And you're relying on these scripts that are actually very hard to learn when you first start driving, to rely on the fact that you actually know how to start the car, stop the car, turn the wheel, etc. These tasks are hard, and you had to think about them the first time you were learning them. But once you've done them a few thousand times, your brain has this kind of procedural knowledge. You don't have to think about it anymore, and you can focus on the task of operating the vehicle safely. I hope everybody has their task. Some people have the task of operating the vehicle as fast as possible. Alternatively, the other kind of procedural knowledge are heuristics and rules of thumb. And we have all sorts of these. I don't have an example off the top of my head of a heuristic, but this is where procedural knowledge can be problematic, especially in the classroom, because there are lots of heuristics and rules of thumb that are not true, right? And you see this a lot with students who are just starting out, because they maybe learned a rule of thumb about something from a chemistry class, for example, that doesn't apply in a physics class because it was just a approximation to some true physical principle. And so you often have to teach people to unlearn procedural knowledge, which is this very kind of automatic knowledge that's operating at a very low level and people are often not aware of. So procedural knowledge is both incredibly important for us to be able to engage in high-level tasks, but it can also be a real challenge as an instructor, because this kind of, at least one category of procedural knowledge can be a barrier to learning in a new domain. Yeah, so self-regulatory knowledge is this kind of knowledge that allows you to monitor your own learning. This is kind of the fundamental knowledge that helps you to be an effective instructor, because if you can monitor your own learning, you are also able often to monitor other people's learning. So this would be domain or topic specific, and domain general kind of subtypes of self-regulatory knowledge. So domain specific knowledge is cues for learning on a specific topic. So you can think about this like the slots that you have in your brain for new knowledge. You basically have these cues about how you can learn something new. So if somebody, well, I guess I'll give an example that somebody brought up this week, but actually I'm going to say it, and whoever it was that was mentioning this, maybe you can describe the email that you got about, was it Chirons or something? Some sort of proposed new unified theory? Who was this? Circlons, yeah. So somebody sends you an email and says, the circlons are the solution to grand unification, but you have domain-specific regulatory knowledge, and you know that that doesn't sound like possible physics, right? So you are able to monitor your learning and say, I'm not going to learn that theory that showed up in my email inbox. I'm going to focus on my research, right? Domain general knowledge is this kind of regulatory knowledge that extends outside of a specific field. So we have these sophisticated skills for learning things. And one of the things is that distinguishes experts, all of us in the room, is that we have a small, often kind of specifically identifiable number of flexible learning strategies. And these have been developed as we've developed this domain-specific knowledge, but these can often translate to other domains as well. You have to be a little bit careful. I think everybody's familiar with people who are experts in one field who overestimate their ability to learn another field, but there are some strategies that are going to go between. So if you've learned something really well, if you're an expert, you do have some transferable self-regulatory knowledge to learn something else that's going to be really difficult. You don't have to completely learn how to learn again once you've learned one field really well. This is an important point. If you can identify these kinds of flexible strategies, and we'll talk about some of them here, I think, in a moment, teaching these strategies is one of the most effective ways of especially assisting students who are struggling. So in studies of students who are struggling to keep up with their peers, learning strategy instruction is one of the most effective interventions. Rather than trying to teach someone a bunch of math that they've struggled with, teaching them the strategies that will help them to learn that math is a better way of catching them up than trying to teach them material by itself, devoid of this background information. Okay, so talking about storage and accessing of information. I'll mention this again. This is kind of going to this picture that I want you to have of knowledge. Knowledge is this kind of connected, multi-referential network structure in the brain. There's a specific model of knowledge and learning called the connectionist model or connectedist model. And this is just kind of a little bit of background. So this model, we're going to talk a lot about like you attempting to learn something, you having regulatory knowledge if you're learning something that implies that there's a mind we all hopefully have direct experience with that is like regulating our learning and thinking about our learning. In these connectivist models, that goes out the window. There's no role for intention, but these connectivist models just focus on the biology of the brain. And they talk about knowledge as being spread across many nodes in a continuum in the brain. And there are many different kinds of connections. And when you learn something, activation patterns are being established in the brain. So this is like a very we're looking at MRI scans of the brain. What is the brain doing when we're learning? But this also provides kind of an empirical foundation for this kind of network model, because it's saying that the brain actually is a network of activation patterns and nodes that are connected in this way. And when you learn something, you can have multiple activation patterns that start in different parts of the brain, that connect different parts of the brain. It's not just like one directional, is kind of the important point. So yeah, so I've said this a few times, but it's always good to continue to say it. So knowledge in these sort of network models is cross-listed, and memory works best with multiple retrieval points. So, and this is something that, again, we all have experience with, is if we talk about, I don't know, star formation models or something like that, at least for me, and I would assume probably for most people in this room, I've learned star formation in a class about stars, I've learned star formation in a class about planets, I've learned star formation in classes about galaxies, and I've learned star formation stuff in classes about the universe as a whole. So I have multiple retrieval points to access the part of my brain that knows things about star formation. And so if somebody asks me a question, I might start by, oh, I remember this thing from my star formation class, or I remember this thing from my solar system science class, or I remember this thing from this other context, or maybe it's from research. But the things you know deeply and the things you know well are going to have many of these retrieval points. So there's many places where the brain can sort of start to activate this kind of networked knowledge and retrieve things. So learning is developing this organization scheme. It's learning is developing this mental framework, which produces understanding. And the key thing is that the biology as a whole is always trying to minimize kind of the what's the word I'm looking for, metabolic cost of things, right? Biology is always trying to minimize effort. So when you have all of these different cross-listed points, your brain is going to go pick the one that is like energetically least costly to go retrieve information. And only if you really need it is it going to try and do something else. So if you have this very cross-listed knowledge, you have this very coherent knowledge, you're going to have a greater access to your own understanding, basically. And as I've said, this kind of background domain is kind of the meta description that we have for all of the different retrieval points that you have. And if you have a wide domain knowledge, you have many different slots to easily put new information in that is kind of automatically cross-listed to everything else you know. Let's see, how are we doing on time here? I have a lot of material to cover, so I don't know if I'm going to say too much about this, but it's a graph. So information is nodes. There's lots of different connections between different kinds of nodes, and yeah, lots of different ways that you can organize information. That's the key point. When you're faced with a task, activation in your brain is running across all of these nodes, so you're getting a bunch of information back at once. Okay, so this was a classic important question. Is a cereal a soup? And so this might be how your brain works. At least this is how my brain worked. So I think soup is this thing over here. I don't know that cereal is really a subset, but I guess there should be a question mark. Does cereal belong to the soup class? But also my brain thinks this is a reasonable comparison because the milk is kind of like broth, I guess, and carb is kind of like the vegetables in the soup. But I don't know, maybe these two things are networked together for me, but I don't think the carbs are really connected to the vegetables in the same way. But the point here is that this is not like a hierarchical, like a directed acyclic graph like we've seen before of like soup goes to cereal, goes to things down here. These things are sitting side by side and there's multiple connections, right? I can get from cereal to soup by following through milk and broth, right? That's how my brain works, but your brain may work differently. Yeah, I guess actually I'll ask the question. Does anybody else, when you're asked a question like, is a taco a sandwich? No. Is a hot dog a taco?
Hot dog is a taco.
Is a hot dog a taco? How does your brain work?
Be careful what you say.
Yeah, well, nobody said there's ketchup on the hot dog, so everyone should be safe.
There's tomatoes in tacos.
Oh, yeah. So this is the kind of picture you want to have in your head, right? Your brain consists of a huge number of these networks. They're all multiply connected. They're not necessarily hierarchical. You can have closed cycles in them, etc. This is the kind of encoding scheme that you want to have. This is also the kind of encoding scheme that you're trying to teach people, right? So one of the, just mentioned as an aside, and I'll come back to this, but one of the most effective teaching strategies that I know of is to have people draw these themselves, especially for complicated information that they're just starting to learn. One of the first steps in studying can be draw your network of concepts and ideas and identify nodes that are less well connected, that are things that you're supposed to be learning based on learning objectives. And you can help students do that because you know what concepts are supposed to be connected that they maybe haven't made that connection, they wouldn't identify. So it's a really effective teaching strategy. Yeah, so I'm also going to sort of skip this. This is just another kind of like the connectedness model, basically about the brain learning, treating the brain as a factory that produces knowledge. So the brain can also learn rules that generate knowledge, but this is pretty similar to the stuff we've already discussed. Okay, so So I'm going to do scaffold building, which is the main educational technique that I think everybody should know. It's the most, I think it's the most well justified, and it's kind of the core, I think, of teaching. So in having, a couple of hours, 3 hours to teach you something about teaching, scaffold building is the core thing to take away. So scaffold building is a style of instruction that provides students with intellectual support to function at the cutting edge of their individual development. I'm actually curious. Does anyone know how to scaffold build based on this definition? I don't think so, but it sure sounds nice. Okay, so elements of scaffolding. So scaffolding is about identifying and performing tasks that are slightly beyond the ability of the person that is learning. So rather than standing up in front of the room and transmitting knowledge, what we're looking to do is we're looking to enter into conversational dialogues. And that dialogue is about identifying those tasks that are slightly beyond somebody's abilities and supporting them and engaging in those tasks. And also understanding if you have gone too far and given them a task that they are not able to complete, so you can sort of pull that down. Again, another role for assessment. So what you're going to help them do is through this dialogue, you're going to help people construct knowledge and develop these self-regulatory pathways so that they can start this process of identifying tasks that are slightly beyond their abilities and engaging in those tasks on their own. So the key idea is this thing called the zone of proximal development. So this is the zone in which an individual's optimum learning can occur. So it's defined as the distance between a student's actual developmental level, usually assessed through some sort of independent assessment. It could be some sort of test or formative assessment. And the independent problem solving and higher level of potential development that they could do under expert guidance. I'll show you a picture. Here's the picture. Oh, I changed the slide color, so this is a little bit harder to read, but I can share this. It's not a complicated diagram. So you have this kind of nested structure, all of the things that the learner can do, all the things that the learner couldn't do, even if you were to sit there and help them with this. So an obvious example is you're teaching a 6th grade algebra class. No matter what you do, those 6th graders cannot do differential geometry. Maybe one of them can, but most of them will not be able to. But they can do, maybe they can do trigonometry, something like that, something a very sophisticated task that lies between the tasks that they have mastered and the tasks that they couldn't do even with expert guidance. And we're going to try and scaffold in this domain between these two tasks, where our instruction will be effective in helping them to develop the sort of new linkages in their knowledge and the self-regulatory knowledge for them to be able to assess how their learning is going, which will help them to, at some later time, be able to learn these tasks that they couldn't do even with you sitting there, giving them guidance on every step. So what you're going to do when you're scaffolding a task is you're going to control elements of a task that are initially beyond a learner's ability. And the reason you're going to control these elements of a task that are very difficult, that they maybe couldn't do even with your expert guidance, is that you want them to focus on completing tasks that they could potentially do. You're taking away the really complicated parts of a task, or the really, maybe complicated is the wrong word, the tasks that require a knowledge that is very disconnected from the networks they have, and you're letting them focus on the tasks that are closer to the networks they already have. So when you're doing this, you are slowly transferring responsibility for them completing the task as you, so that you're moving more and more of these things into the learner's range of competence. This is an iterative, extended process of teaching and learning. So what we're trying to teach ultimately is often problem solving. So why don't we take a second, and I'm going to introduce some problem solving models, but talk with the person next to you about what you think problem solving is, and then we'll share back in a couple of minutes.
What is problem solving?
I think this question is very vague.
Agreed. That part, I don't.
I guess it's like something procedural. There's kind of like steps to it, right? Problem solving is the ability to like
Follow the steps, getting.
yeah, almost like coming up with them yourself, right? Like you're presented with a problem, you're not necessarily presented with the steps, so you have to like devise a plan. But I think that's what it ends up being. You'll come up with a plan to address some problem.
Problem solving is basically coming up with the stuff.
Yeah, yeah. What do you think about teaching stuff?
Interesting.
What do you think? Yeah, I mean, I've seen like a little bit of it before, because Columbia has like a sport. But a lot of it, I think, you don't want more processing. Yeah, I do observational stuff, and a lot of my work is like trying to measure photometry and stuff. It would be really useful. I think like so far it's been mostly stuff I know, so I want to get into stuff. What about you? Did you observational or theoretical?
I did theoretical, now I'm observational. I don't really look at the images. Whenever I have to do something with the image, I will ask someone to do it.
Yeah, that's the best way to do it. I don't like doing the photometry, to be clear. Like,
Yeah, it's a little too fast. But it's like it's useful.
Maybe 30 more seconds to finish up the thought.
Yeah, John.
Yeah, yeah. It's over, and you're like, oh, I could
Okay, seems like most people's conversations have wrapped up. Does anyone want to share back some kind of high level thoughts about what problem solving is? How did you engage in the task of answering what problem solving is?
We kind of like tripped over a bunch of synonyms at first, and then decided that it was navigating progression.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's an interesting thing I'll come back to about the synonyms. Yeah, but that actually says something deep about problem solving. There's a suggestion in the back. So that's a fascinating answer, because that is not how most people think about problem solving. That is how probably everybody in this room thinks about problem solving, right? So we all, like, one of the things that distinguishes expert learners from novice learners is that we excel at planning our route through the problem, right? And we excel at changing our route if it's not working. That's one of the main things that distinguishes experts. It's not having a deep domain-specific knowledge, although that is another thing that distinguishes experts. It's that planning process of problem solving. If you think about tasks when you that are genuinely novel that you've never encountered before, I bet you won't. The first thing you want to do probably will not be to plan your path for solving that task you've never encountered before. Any other suggestions?
Thought on that last point.
Yeah.
There's a cosmologist in my department who likes to say physicists are lazy. And I think it's really interesting how like people who are experts know what it is to work hard on a problem and therefore will always choose the laziest possible solution, which means they won't unnecessarily waste time on an approach that isn't working.
Yeah, and the path. I mean, this is another point I was going to go back to, is the paths that experts pick are picked usually based on some sort of efficiency. And I mean, as I said earlier, right, there's some metabolic reasons that the brain learns and stores information in this way, which is to sort of minimize the metabolic cost of cognition. Because that's the hand-wavy story that the educational psychology textbooks say. Talk to an actual biochemist about that. Here it is. Okay. So this was a little bit higher level maybe, but problem solving is the cognitive process that aims to achieve a goal with no obvious solution by manipulating knowledge. So how does the brain do this? Well, and this goes to the suggestion, right? So you come up with a situation model, which is some internal representation of the problem space, which includes where you start and where you're going, plus all the intervening configurations that you hope to go through. And you engage in this self-regulatory process of assessing whether you are making progress from where you started, where you ended, going through some set of intermediate stages. And if it's not working, you're going to change the set of intermediate stages, or you might even change the final stage of the working. So when you're teaching novices, right, you're trying to teach them to engage in this process and to be able to do this efficiently. So there's this sort of model, has some name. There's a bit of declarative knowledge that I do not have appropriately cross-listed in my brain, and I can't remember what this is actually called, but this is the model. And so you have some sensory memory, you have your working memory, which is your short-term memory. It's the part of the brain that is actively kind of engaged and taking stuff from long-term memory and connecting it to the sensory knowledge that you're getting from the world around you. So you're, where you're directing your attention is encoding sensory memory into working memory. And you are also integrating, when you're engaged in the learning process, you are integrating things that you have directed your attention to into long-term memory, these network schema. And so when you're trying to solve a problem, you are then pulling information from your long-term memory back into your working memory and using that to form actions which affect your sensory. So kind of model of problem solving in terms of what's going on in the brain. And so again, there's this kind of big bottleneck, maybe two bottlenecks. There's a bottleneck from sensory memory to working memory, and there's potentially some bottlenecks from long-term memory into working memory. I can't remember what this model is called. That's a bottleneck from long-term memory. Probably 10 minutes after finishing this talk, I will remember and feel really bad about having forgotten, which maybe is an action of feeling bad about having forgotten. So why is problem solving hard? So it's the limits of working memory. And as I mentioned before, experts, all of us, we have automated a large number of component skills. If I give you a block on an inclined plane, you are not even going to think about what equation to use. You will have automated the process of drawing the picture, drawing a free body diagram, writing down the forces, going through that. You probably will not use any of the actual abstract machinery that you taught because you have automated an understanding of the physics of that problem and are able to solve it. What this does is this frees up working memory for more complex task performance. So again, if I give you a picture of the solar system and I say derive Kepler's laws, it's a hard, complicated task. I don't remember exactly how to do that, but I know enough that I probably could do it given some amount of time, because all of the simpler tasks, all of the lower level tasks of drawing free body diagrams, knowing Newton's laws, how to apply them, all of that is automated, so I can focus on this much harder task of deriving these abstract principles of orbital dynamics. Okay, so load reducing skills are key. So everybody got that right? Okay, yeah. So how many of the load reducing skills did people remember? See any of them? Okay, yeah, that was the point there.
Drilling.
Drilling. Oh, awesome. Okay, can you drill on all the other ones? No?
I need to see if we can.
Yeah. So yeah, don't do that, right? That's the stage on a stage model where you are not reducing the load on everybody. You just put up the list and say, remember all of those, right? So let's go through them by breaking them up into smaller chunks. So drilling, makes skills automatic. This is really good for kind of low level component tasks. So, and this is something that obviously like people could study. Olympic athletes, they do a lot of drilling, right? We also do a lot of drilling. We do a lot of simple problems in our education so that we can make these skills automatic. It looks different than an Olympic athlete or an award-winning musician or something, but it's the same sort of thing. As an instructor, your job is to be a guide on the side. And what you're doing there is you're directing the attention of the learner on the relevant task that is the next step in their learning and their construction of these networked information models. And you're directing their attention away from irrelevant tasks. And a lot of our differences in teaching are our own personal judgments based on our own learning experiences about what is and isn't a relevant task to direct attention to. Advanced planning can help reduce mental load while performing a task. So this goes to, again, the suggestion of we're going to plan our route through the problem. We're not going to try and do everything on the fly and guess what the next step is. We're going to say the first step is I'm going to draw a picture of this problem. The next step is I'm going to write down some equations. I'm going to solve them. I'm going to, whatever it is, right? We're going to plan out what the task is. So queuing is a really important thing, which is you have a really highly cross-listed network in your brain. So you can provide a cue to say, oh, I think this is related to this idea that you might have seen really recently. Right? So you can help them direct their attention by queuing to some other piece of information that you expect them to know. And of course, you guess wrong, you can do that again, right? And you can do that again until you have gotten down to something the learner does know. So queuing is also a good way to sort of judge the zone of proximal development, which is where you want to be teaching. Elaborating on things is, elaborating, giving a very explicit accounting of all these connections. So hopefully that's a little bit self-explanatory. Note-taking is about reducing the kind of bottleneck by giving your working memory some additional space so that you can direct your attention to many different things, more things that you can hold in working memory in your head. So that's obviously helpful. Questioning. So this is a common thing. This is the Socratic method, right? Is you ask questions that are leading, that are intended to help the learner form their own connections. So rather than pointing them towards some connection that you think they have, you're asking them questions that help you to understand what connections they have and help the learner to understand what connections they have. And then we're going to go through guided discovery, which is a example scaffold learning or scaffolding technique. So we're going to do that as the activity in a few minutes. An important thing is choosing the right problems. So when you're designing a problem set, and I hope you'll see this when you look at DSFP problem notebooks in the future, is you want to have early problems that are helping to identify and assess where this zone of proximal development is, right? So it's not about having problems that are necessarily easy. They can be quite challenging, but they should be problems that are giving you meaningful feedback about what needs to be learned in order to accomplish the tasks that are currently outside of this kind of zone of possible tasks. We do this very explicitly, right? We say that you're informed that the problems we're giving you are going to be difficult. And I think I also really try to give students choices about what problems they're going to work on, because it's also part of developing that regulatory knowledge for people to have a sense of this problem seems hard to me. This problem maybe is a problem I'll leave for after I've learned some other things or whatever. So that aspect of giving people agency is both about making people feel comfortable, so the barriers and the kind of threat comes down so they can learn, but it's also about helping people to develop this kind of self-regulatory knowledge. So giving people agency on what problems they work on is also really important. So in scaffolding, you want people to be working on these problems. Again, you're trying to get them to work in this regime where they can do something with assistance, which is not them doing it with you doing everything for them. And it's also not with them doing it completely by themselves. You're working in this regime. So you are, you want to encourage people to work until people get stuck. And then when somebody gets stuck, you have a number of different strategies that you can pursue to help people to figure out how they're going to solve this problem that they can't already solve. So one of the things that you might do when somebody makes a mistake or encounters a problem is you might say, you know what, that's actually not an important thing for us to be focused on right now. That's not consequential for our learning, right? And so you see that when there's a typo in the notebook or something, right? It's like, fix the typo, you don't need to worry about it, or, lots of other examples, right? But there's all sorts of kind of simple mistakes or even maybe complicated mistakes that just aren't relevant for learning based on where a learner is in your assessment of their zone of proximal development. Sometimes you want to try and prevent errors before they occur. And this is going to be where you are seeing, this is as an instructor, when you do a problem set or something, you're walking around the room and you're talking to a bunch of people and you realize, oh, everyone is making this one mistake, right? So I can get up here and I can say, that's either important or that's not important, right? But we can try and head off a mistake that is not going to help people develop their independent learning ability and focus on other things. Again, reducing the load so people can focus on the important parts. The thing that you see people do that is maybe not good is intervening for things that are not limited or simple mistakes, right? So if somebody is doing something that is a simple mistake that is easy to correct and it's a barrier to them learning a more complicated thing, it's good to intervene if you can, but you shouldn't intervene if somebody is working on something that is genuinely hard and they need to sit through, build the connections to be able to see why it's a problem. Right? If you intervene too early, you're not going to help somebody build the self-regulatory knowledge that they need to be learning. The sort of last step, and this goes to assessment, which we're going to talk about later in the week too, is that you should always ask learners to reflect on a problem, describe their experience, and draw comparisons with other problems. And this is about keying these retrievals. So if we go back to our many slides ago, go back to this, right? We want to continue to key after the learning experience the storage and retrieval mechanisms so that people, when encountering a problem and not there, will actually be able to pull their experiences back into their working memory to solve a new problem. So this process of reflecting at the end of doing a learning activity is really important for building this storage and retrieval skills. So we are almost out of time, so I might come back to this stuff later on Friday if there's time, but I think we have a break scheduled. Is anybody looking at the schedule for the next half hour? And then we'll come back and do the guided discovery activity. So, yeah, I guess real quick before we go to the break, are there any questions about any of this? Hour of listening, so definitely take a break. Okay, so we'll come back at the bottom of the hour.
Is it?